Hey, everybody. Well, welcome. This is Psilocybin-assisted therapy associations, our first part in our series on self-employment within the psychedelic industry. We have this is a multi-part series that we're starting off with Justin Calyx with Calyx CPA, and then we'll be moving forward into some other subjects. So really appreciate everybody taking the time to be here today. So my name is Jason Burge, and I am the co-founder and chief business officer with the Psilocybin-Assisted Therapy Association, PATA. Our mission is to promote the advancement of psilocybin-assisted therapy to address the mental health crisis. Our community involves everybody that's involved in that process that can help somebody reach their mental health goals, including our valuable practitioners and folks that are actually the healers and making all of this happen within the industry. Really honored to have Justin here with us today from Calyx CPA. He's a strong partner of PATA's. He's a strong partner within the entire industry, and really does a lot to promote, to make sure that education is out there so that we can have a long-running and sustainable future within this industry. A couple of ground rules. This series is being recorded. And this will be available online in the future. At the end of it, we will be stopping the recording. That if you wish to ask for a question off of recording, you may do so at that time. The first two parts will be by Justin on the accounting legal issues. And he will advise on that here in a little bit. The next one will be by Sean Clancy with Emerge Law Group on the legal landscape of what's going into up to current, followed by that by Todd Foster with Oath Insurance on really what does insurance look like, what is the liability, how to address that, how to really read these insurance policies, and then we'll have more on some strategic planning. Throughout this, if you do find it, if there's a topic that you think really would be relevant, please put it into the chat, and and we'll see what we can do if we get enough consensus. And that's certainly another series that we could potentially, or another session we could add to the series. Our disclaimer is that we have no discussions around products. If you wish to have offline discussions around that, we're just talking about how do we support each other to ultimately educate and empower for the mental health of our clients in our community out there. Please be respectful of everybody's views. Everybody has a view and it is valid. This is not the place that we're going to have larger discussions around independent views. So let's keep it focused on what Justin's presenting today. And that we're all here unified together around a common theme. I would like for the side chat bars to, if you have individual conversations, direct it to somebody. Put your questions into the side chat bar, and I will take a look at them, ongoing. And if it's something that needs to be addressed immediately, I will bring it up with Justin, and he'll explain the rest of his outline of when questions will begin. But please don't have long sidebar conversations, as that can distract from everybody as well as the presenter. And with that, I will pass it over to Justin. Thank you very much.
Okay, right on. Thank you. I'm going to share my presentation, my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. Jason, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is usually I'm more of like a freestyle presenter. I don't usually have like a presentation. And what I find when I do these kinds of presentations is I might get ahead of myself. I often like blow through information very quickly. So what I'm going to try to do is slow it down a little bit and go over my presentation slide by slide. I'm not a big fan of reading content, but you might find that I will this time, because again, I'm trying to stay on point, and this is not a presentation that I technically typically rehearse. It's just something that I know it's around topics that I know very well. And so I can talk about them day in and day out. So like Jason said, this is I'm kind of in charge of a two-part course. And so it's divided into two parts. The first part is actually I'm going to overlap a little bit into legal landscape. A lot of this is stuff that you already know probably. Like for example, where there's psychedelics are decriminalized versus what states have programs. And so this first part's probably not going to be really new for you. But I also want to touch base on it because you may not be familiar with it. So I feel like I need to kind of start from the beginning. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Controlled Substances Act and Schedule 1, Schedule 3, and what it means for people, and what it means for people who are in business in the psychedelics industry, specifically psilocybin. I'm going to talk about this course is kind of more designed for people who are providing services like facilitation specifically, but guides and spiritual teachers. And I'll probably talk a little bit about Colorado's decrim rules right now. They are currently putting together their program similar to Oregon, but right now they have other avenues for people to participate in the industry legally. I'll touch on that. I mean, that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about. So I'm like, again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's go ahead and move on. See if I can. Okay. So yeah, a little bit about me. I've been self-employed for almost 20 years. When I first started, I did some bookkeeping. I was doing bookkeeping for small businesses. And then I was working for CPA firms during the tax seasons, doing some tax preparation work. And then eventually my business clients, my bookkeeping clients, took a leap of faith and went with me for getting their tax returns done. And so after a few years of working for other people, I went into starting a tax practice on my own. And I worked with mostly small businesses. So I really got to know small business considerations like legal structures and the differences between the tax entities and the benefits and the pros and cons for each type of tax entity. And then just being in business for myself for so many years, I really understand the challenges that small business owners face just being self-employed. And so I'm going to that's probably what a lot of this presentation is going to be, is like, what are some of the myths about being self-employed? And believe it or not, most of you are self-employed. So some people will be like, I don't know if I have an employer. And the question is, well, are you getting a 1099 from your employer, or are you getting a W-2? If you're getting a 1099, then you are self-employed. You're a business owner. Congratulations. And so, there's a lot to consider if you're self-employed. Being an employee is one thing. It's a lot easier. The tax filings are simple, and there's not a lot of flexibility there, and the liability is on your employer for a lot of these things. But if you're self-employed, then the liability is on you, and so you need to know what you need to do to stay in compliance. And not this session, but the next session, I'll talk to you about like just some tips and tricks to get started, like things that you need to get take into consideration when you're first starting to get paid and whatnot. So I know that this group is going to be varied. There's going to be people who are maybe in the medical profession, who have had their own clinics, for example, who might be psychologists or nurses, or maybe they got into ketamine already, which is currently a legal service that people could provide. So there's a lot to talk about. And then my experience in how I got into psilocybin was essentially starting in like 2014. I got into cannabis, and so I had a lot of people who kind of knocked on my door here in Southern Oregon, because there's a lot of people who were coming out of the woodwork, out of the mountains, the hillsides, that needed to get ready for the recreational regulated market here in Oregon. And and they didn't know how to be in business either. They were doing handshake deals and they didn't ever pay taxes and all that stuff. So I got a really good experience working with like kind of the gray market industry of cannabis. And then eventually it kind of all tipped over to all like legal. And then there was a combination of hemp and then the state programs. And so it's been very interesting. And one of the things that I'll talk about is 280E, which is an IRS code section that prohibits you being allowed to take your deductions if you're a trafficking business, which psilocybin is a Schedule I drug according to the Controlled Substances Act, and therefore your deductions are limited. And again, this presentation is more for service providers, and I'll talk a little bit about whether or not you being a service provider are subject to 280E. And is that something that you need to take into consideration when you're filing taxes and doing your bookkeeping and whatnot? I'm almost 90% in cannabis, and now I'm like 5% into psilocybin in terms of my book of business. I work with a couple dozen people. I work with a handful of the first service centers and a handful of and a couple of training companies and some facilitators. And so I feel very fortunate to be in Oregon, specifically in Southern Oregon, where I've gotten to be introduced to this. And my experience with psilocybin has made me a lifelong advocate. When I was 17, I had a pretty traumatic childhood, or I experienced a lot of trauma when I was a child, and I had a lot of like kind of maladaptive behaviors because of that. But then when I was 17 years old, a friend of mine introduced me to psilocybin. He had more experience, and he kind of was like a guide, and the universe aligned where I was able to secure some psilocybin. My parents were out of town, and we happened to live out in kind of the hills out of Eagle Point, where it's quite beautiful. And of course, I was taking it for granted out there. I just assumed we were all a bunch of rednecks out there. So, but I had gotten to experience psilocybin for the first time, and it blew my mind, really. And all of a sudden, my awareness expanded exponentially. I don't recall even seeing color very well. Like my childhood memories don't involve a lot of color. And then when the psilocybin first started taking effect, it was like when I saw the colors, which is kind of a common characteristic of the psychedelic experience, that it just stayed. I was working at a grocery store, and I was just astounded at the abundance that we experience, that surrounds us. And it's not something that myself or even I think my parents probably experience. But because of that, I've been a lifelong advocate for it. So I'm so thankful that I can be here with you guys and also helping people in the industry, and then also getting paid for it. So that's amazing. So again, I don't need to go back over what historically the history of psychedelics. I just know that currently we're in a period of time in which Western cultures are adopting psychedelics like at no other time. Of course, they've been around with us for thousands of years, but now we're experiencing a renaissance, and it couldn't be at a better time considering the mental health crisis that we're currently experiencing, which is crazy because we have so much abundance and so many tools, but yet we're at an all-time low in terms of mental health. And so I think it was Ram Dass who said that in India, they are materially poor, but very spiritually rich there. But in the United States, we're materially rich, but spiritually poor. And sometimes a material question needs a material answer. So something like that. I don't know if I stated it just exactly like that, but I always liked that. And that's exactly what's happening. Sometimes, you know, we can't seem to get everybody to meditate all the time, but maybe the psychedelic experience could get people to start to reconsider their mental health, expand their consciousness. Right now, psilocybin and most all psychedelics are federally illegal. They're considered Schedule 1 drugs according to the Controlled Substances Act, except for ketamine, which is a Schedule 3, which can be used therapeutically and prescribed, which there is an industry for that, and it's thriving and getting bigger, and people are recognizing the benefits of ketamine. And I just recently had my first experience with ketamine, and what I learned was each psychedelic has its own qualities, and I think it has its own therapeutic use. And I think ketamine for me I think it was a good introduction to the psychedelic experience, but I think psilocybin is where the work really gets done. That's my experience. So, like I said, we know that Oregon has its own program. Colorado is forming its own program, and people are applying I believe they are now applying for licenses to be involved in a regulated industry similar to Oregon's regulated market. I'm not absolutely clear on the names. Like, I think the service centers there are called health centers. But it's been a while since I've been updated on that. But Colorado, actually, what I wanted to say about Colorado is Colorado has a very unique decriminalized environment where it's interesting. You can gift psychedelics, and you can have psychedelics. It's not illegal to have psychedelics. You just can't sell them right now. But what's interesting, and this is going to be very interesting from an accounting perspective, a tax and accounting perspective, is that in Colorado, you can sell your services and then gift the medicine. So that's something that I'll probably talk about, like whether or not, well, is that subject to 280 versus what we're doing here in Oregon, where you really can't touch the medicine. You have to, as a facilitator, you can't touch the medicine. Only the administrator of the service center can touch the medicine. And then you're just there to sit and provide caregiving services, essentially. And is that subject to 280? Is that considered trafficking? So that's, what I would like to go over. The history of the Controlled Substances Act was essentially, it was just part of the war on drugs, and Congress passed it to fight drugs, I guess. Some people say it was very racist. It had very racist reasons for its existence. I learned a lot about the organized crime and landscape back in the 80s too. And what people don't understand is that organized crime was rampant. We had the big cartels, like the big family organized crime rings, the Irish and the Italian and all that stuff. And they actually all united, had a united front. And so part of the war on drugs was actually the war on these organized crime families. And in the 90s, the federal government really cracked down on these crime rings. For some reason, I can't think of the word that I'm trying to just organized crime, and they were able to bust and take down the whole thing in the 90s, almost the whole apparatus. But yet we're still left with the Controlled Substances Act, and therefore we are also left with 280E. Which is it's just kind of an archaic kind of penalty they were using to help convict drug or organized crime, and because they might have not been able to get them because of the dirty deeds that they were doing, but they could get them on tax evasion. And so they were able to, so that was part of the reason for 280E, is that it was just kind of help them be able to prosecute these people when they couldn't prosecute them any other way. I think certainly cannabis being a Schedule I drug is probably racist for sure. And I think there's arguments to that. But yeah, here we are. So cannabis is still a Schedule I drug, LSD, MDMA. Unfortunately, MDMA, the FDA, like I think you probably know, did not approve MDMA like we wanted, and instead there was some journals that redacted their publications, and it's almost as if they have to start over. I'm not exactly sure where it's at, but MDMA was slotted for Schedule III, so it could be similar to ketamine and prescribed, but it is now been delayed, unfortunately, for people who could benefit from this medicine. So I did talk a little bit about 280E. 280E does a lot, unfortunately. 280E makes it so you're going to have a hard time with banking. It makes it very difficult to do research. It's definitely a tax penalty. So let me give you an example of, if your business is subject to 280E, then you cannot take any deduction that is not related to purchases for resale, for example. So if a service provider truly is subject to 280E, if you're out there doing facilitation services, and the IRS or maybe your more uninformed accountant says that you're subject to 280E, that means you're not going to get any deductions. So that's not necessarily true. There are ways to mitigate that, and I believe, and I would say that any reasonable experienced accountant in this industry would conclude that you, as a service provider, someone who is not touching the medicine, is not subject to 280E. So your spiritual guides, your coaches, your facilitators, your service providers, if the service center is providing the medicine, they're trafficking, you're not. So trafficking involves the manufacture, distribution, or possession with the intent to distribute controlled substances. So if you're not manufacturing and you're not distributing and you're not possessing the medicine, then you are not trafficking, and therefore you're not subject to 280E. You may still have a hard time getting a bank account, and you probably don't want to throw out there that you're in the psychedelics industry, but you are likely not going to be subject to 280E. It's very, very unlikely. And then even if you were, there are other, if somebody said that you're subject, there's precedents saying that you aren't. For example, Californians helping alleviate medical problems. That was a tax court case that was tried in the cannabis industry, in which there was a bunch of caregivers, medical professionals that were providing medical caregiving while providing cannabis. And the IRS stripped them of their nonprofit status, said, you guys are definitely trafficking, you get no deductions. And it bankrupted them, which was a big bummer for those people, because it put them out of business. But then they fought back, and they took it to the tax court of appeals, and they said, hey, we should be able to deduct our expenses having to do with the services that we're providing. And the tax courts ruled in their favor. So that's really good news, because really the psychedelics industry is more of a service versus a commodity like cannabis. And I don't think that you're going to have to go through all the rigmarole that the cannabis industry went through. I think the cannabis industry really paved the ways for people in this industry and made it a lot easier. And especially from like tax perspective, even if you are in a trafficking business, like the methods for mitigating 280E are established and tried and true. And all we have to do is tweak them a little bit, and then we can apply them to your business as well. And in the cannabis industry, there's even like arguments as to against whether or not it was even constitutional for state regulated programs to be subject or enforced by the Controlled Substances Act. There's an argument a reasonable argument saying that in our current federal climate with a very conservative Supreme Court justice, obviously, like they overruled Roe versus Wade, which is insane, but for these purposes, it's kind of in our favor to have a very conservative Supreme Court, because if we were to argue that, hey, states should have sovereignty over their own drug policies, and we're not even allowed to cross borders, right? We can't sell mushrooms across states lines, right? So the manufacturers in Oregon can only sell in Oregon legally, and the manufacturers in Colorado can only sell in Colorado. They're not allowed to cross state lines. And if we're operating in a legal framework, then we should not be subject to 280, or we should not be subject to Controlled Substances Act, and we should not be subject to 280E. It's a states' rights thing. And I think that everybody in the Supreme Court would be nodding their head. Yes, indeed. We believe that to be true too. And if a case were to be taken to the Supreme Court arguing that, which I think there are some people who are trying to do that, but I think that it would ultimately, the Controlled Substances Act will be overruled for states with their own drug policies. But that's really far down the line, and so I don't know when that's going to happen. Okay, so again, I got ahead of myself. I went over a lot of these things, talking about the types of businesses, commodity versus service business. Advantages are that we're in it's a new technology. That's also a disadvantage that it's a new technology, because I've been visiting with people in the service centers across Oregon, and people thought they would be making more money. It would be a little bit more popular than it is. But they're finding that some people are steady, some people are needing to get out there and spread awareness, and sometimes the demand comes and goes with the news. Sometimes some sort of news article or publication might put out an article, a national publication, and all of a sudden there will be a spike in attendance, but then it really dies down. There's still definitely a lack of awareness around this. And that really is, people are feeling that. People in the psilocybin space in Oregon are feeling that. They're surprised, and not everybody is making a ton of money. People aren't making. I would not say that people aren't making money, but I would say that it's like any other business with new technology, where only the early adopters are showing up. And at some point, there'll probably be a tipping point, a critical mass, where all of a sudden it's like something happens where the popular feeling over psychedelics is going to tip, like give the nod, and then all of a sudden people are going to be coming in and being like, realizing, wow, this is a powerful medicine. But right now it's not happening. Right now it's not. But the cool thing is, you guys are early in. You're going to be able to, you're going to get that history for when you guys are going to be the authority on this. You've got the history. There's going to be, as states legalize across the United States, you will be looked to for experience, and so that's pretty cool. And then, of course, we're in such a fulfilling industry as well. But there, of course, we've got other issues, like I said, banking, stigma, and definitely like the emotional intensity of the work. Of course, you're working with people who may have trauma, and I wanted to be a therapist. I have a degree in psychology back when I was in college because of my psychedelic experience or my psilocybin experiences, but I still had a lot of work to do for myself, and I liked accounting better, oddly. All right. So there's a great book. If you're new to self-employment, there's a great book. It's called E-Myth. And this is like a good book for anybody who wants to be self-employed. There's like this idea that, hey, I can go out and start my own business. Maybe I flip, maybe I'm a really good pancake maker. I'm going to go start a restaurant and I'm going to be my own boss. I'm going to make more money and I'm going to have more hours in my time. And unfortunately, that's all it's upside down. You will make less money. You will work more than you were working before, and you will have more bosses because every client of yours is going to be your boss. So, so those are like things that you need to consider when going out on your own. And there's people who can be self-employed. There's people who can adapt their business to be more of like a job, and they just have to take care of all the other little nuances that come with being self-employed. But then there are people who think that they're running a business, and really they might have some people that they work well together, but you get one issue and then the whole thing falls apart. Maybe you abdicate responsibility to an administrator. You're busy doing your thing, doing facilitation, doing services, getting out there marketing. You're abdicating responsibility to somebody else, and then that person gets burned out and leaves, and now you're up a creek. These kinds of things. Like, and there are so many things. You're like, you got in business for yourself because of the one thing that you're really good at. Maybe it was making pancakes. But then you realize that you have 20 hats that you have to wear. There's the accounting hat, there's the marketing hat, there's the compliance hat, there's the human resources hat. And then having employees is a whole new level. So I just thought I would throw that out there. It's work, it's hard work. And there are people who are like, what, I just want to stay small. I just want to have, maybe they'll have one or two service centers that employ them. That's what I'm seeing right now is a lot of people who just have one or two service centers that they go and they take their clients to, and or they get hired by the service center to come in and do facilitation work. And you can keep it simple. You can keep it simple. And then there's maybe you want to grow a facilitation service, be a facilitation service provider. Or there's people who want to be people who are doing compliance work and want to be a compliance provider. Or maybe you want to be an accountant in the industry, a bookkeeper. So then there's all sorts of things that people can do. Again, time management is probably one of the most difficult things that you learn as a business owner, a small business owner, is like that you're either too slow often, and then you start stressing about money, or you're too busy and then you don't have any time. And really trying to figure out that balance is, and you guys probably more than any business owner will just kind of have a natural tendency to this. I haven't figured it out myself. I'll go I always work overtime personally, and then I complain that I don't have any time. But that's really what you kind of want to look for from the beginning, and kind of identify, what do you want for yourself? Like, you really do need to understand. That's like the question. That's the big question. That's the destination. There's a really good book called Roadmap to Success or something like that. I actually don't know what it's called. But it's all in the title, right? It's like you want to know where to put your location in the GPS in order to get there. You need to know what you want out of this occupation. And then what you do is, once you've like kind of formulated that in your mind, maybe wrote it down, maybe journaled it, maybe had a couple sessions with psilocybin to really know what you want to get out of what you're doing. and what is an ideal workday for you. And then that's really the first thing that you need to do as a small business owner. And then hopefully, and usually what happens is everything kind of like all question that it's kind of like the directing, it provides direction for you. And so then any other question that you're faced with is this getting me to where I want to go? That's the question that you need to ask yourself. And of course, if providing these facilitation services is what you want to be doing in your day-to-day, then you're already there mostly. And so then the question is, well, how much do I want to make in my life? What kind of money do I need to make that affords me the life that I envision for myself? And can I do so many sessions per week and charge this much money? And will that get me to where I need to go? And then, of course, you got to take into consideration taxes and those kinds of things. But that is probably one of my biggest pieces of advice for people who are self-employed. So actually, I am wrapping up this session, and I went ahead and added the second session, which gets into the more of the nitty-gritty about legal entity, some of the considerations that you need to be aware of in regard to taxes as a self-employed person, whether or not you're an independent contractor or a W-2 employee. And I'll go ahead and go into that because we still have some time. And it's the heavier subject. Like, this wasn't that heavy. Most of you knew pretty much everything that I had to say. But this next section is where my expertise really lies. And so I'm going to go ahead and start the next session, but I am going to probably leave you with a lot of questions. And we have some time to answer those questions, but then ultimately what we want to do is then come back and revisit this information the next session. So let's just do this. And Jason, did you want to chime in? Is now a good time to pause? And I mean, we could potentially ask or we could answer some questions, or should I go ahead and move right into legal consideration, taxation, and business structure?
Why don't we move in and then maybe another 5-10 minutes, and then we'll pause for questions and
Okay.
answers. And knowing that we will be revisiting all of this in the next session, so we can provide at least 10-15 minutes of some Q&A on record, and then we'll have a few minutes off record, and then more time as we get into the nitty-gritty next.
Okay.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the big questions that I get asked a lot is, and this is actually more for employers, because employers are the ones that ultimately take the responsibility for how they treat their employees. Most people who've been an employee all their life think that they're going to become a facilitator, they're going to get licensed, and then they're going to become an employee. And I hear people even refer to their independent contract laborers as employees. And so we just have to be very careful to make the distinction between the two. Are you hiring independent contractors, or are you hiring employees? And there's very specific rules that determine whether or not you're hiring an independent contractor, or you're hiring an employee. And those 5 things here are, you can be considered an independent contractor, and really an employer. It's less expensive to have independent contractors, and that's why a lot of companies that are bootstrapping it will try to consider their employees as independent contractors. And that's fine if they fit this criteria. And the criteria is do they have the freedom to work multiple jobs? And I wrote that wrong. Freedom to work for multiple clients is now for if you're a facilitator, each service center might be your client. I'm not talking about the people who you're trying to help. I'm talking about the people who are paying you. In this case, if you're a facilitator, then the service center is paying you potentially. If or you might be one of those that is getting paid directly by the client, by the customer of the service center. And so if you're getting paid directly for facilitation services, then that almost definitely indicates that you're an independent contractor, you're a business owner. But sometimes the service center will get paid by the client and the service center will pay you. And so that's what I'm kind of talking about here. I'm talking about like, are you allowed as a facilitator to work for multiple service centers? Or are you even being paid by the service center? Then chances are you're an independent contractor. You get to set your own hours. You can tell them, like, I'm available at this time and that time, or you can give them a calendar and they can schedule for you, but you dictate when you work. And that's another key indicator. You don't have to be trained. That's another thing. Like if you're having to be trained by, say, a service center or a company that's doing facilitation services, and they're training you to do the work that you're doing, then that might indicate that you're an employee. I would recommend that, for employers, if they're considering their employees or their people that they're paying to do these services as independent contractors, then they really ought to help them or have them go out and register an LLC. And then and then also a contractor agreement that states in there that, hey, you're an independent contractor. You're responsible for managing your own books and records, and you're responsible for paying your own taxes. And that document needs to be very, very clear for everybody who is working as an independent contractor for, say, that service center or for yourself, or that's something that you need to ask for from your employer, because from the people who are paying you, because you might not want to even be an employee, but you definitely don't want to get caught in the middle where it's undecisive. And so for employers, I often warn them, like, hey, the taxes are going to be more for them, and if they think that they're an employee, then it's really putting you at risk, because what if you lay them off or there's no work, and then they go to the employment department and they say, well, I was working for this people the last year or so. And then they're like, well, we have no record that person paid any unemployment tax on your behalf. So then what happens is the employment department goes to the employer and then audits them and then assesses back tax, which then may or may not get to the federal government. And then the federal government comes in and says, and we want our Social Security and Medicare for all of that, which is very, very expensive. So you really don't want to mess with this. You either have employees or you have an independent contractors, and you just want to make sure that it's documented and that the independent contractors know that they're responsible for their own taxes and their own books and records. And you're just going to cut them a check, but you're not going to withhold any taxes or anything like that from that. And then you're going to give them a 1099. And then there's all sorts of strategies for that facilitator to be able to try to mitigate their tax liabilities, because it's very expensive to be self-employed. You get what's called self-employment tax. So one of the differences between an independent contractor and employee is that for an employee, their taxes are being taken out of their checks every payroll. They've got Medicare and Social Security, and then the employer is paying half their Social Security and half their Medicare, and then there's federal unemployment tax and there's state unemployment tax. And that's all being handled by the payroll provider. So the employee is just does their W-2, puts their W-2 in the tax software, and then voila, they know if they're getting a refund or not. It's not the same for being an independent contractor. You need to be tracking your income, your expenses, and then you need to also be putting aside money for taxes, because the way the system is set up now, you really don't have to make a lot of money to owe a lot in tax. I was dumbfounded, like the very first time that I did my own self-employed tax return, even it was years ago. And I made like $24,000 for the year, which is $2,000 a month. And then I had to pay $6,000 in taxes, which was insane. Like, because that's putting me from just under the poverty or over the poverty level to under the poverty level, like, which was crazy. And so taxes for self-employed people is just insane. So there are strategies, and we're going to go into those strategies, but there are strategies to mitigate that. But you want to put away, 25% minimum of the money that you're making, that you're pulling out of these, out of this business. And not pulling out of the business, just whatever money you make, you need to put away 25% of that and put that away for taxes. And then if you're lucky, that's how much you'll pay. Sometimes you might pay more depending on what you make. But for a first-time facilitator, service provider who's just getting into this industry, who's just getting into business for themselves, 25% should do it. And you just want to make sure that you've got a good Excel spreadsheet going, or you got QuickBooks Online, and you're keeping track of your expenses, and you've got good records for that. QuickBooks Online will even do, like, you could take pictures of your receipt, and then it attaches to the transactions and whatnot. I got ahead of myself, but that's the kind of information that we're going to talk about next time. So, and I'll probably go over that again, but I will go over all of that. And then I'm going to talk about legal structures. I'm going to talk about tax entities and the pros and cons of each. And then I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how to get started for that. But I think that's a good stopping point, Jason.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Justin. That was great. And I'll add in on an HR side around the self-employed versus being employed, is that if you are managing somebody, you should be an employee of the organization so that you have the coverage of liability. On the HR side, that's one of the key things. So if you are an independent contractor and then they're asking you to be overseeing other employees, you are likely not an independent contractor, even though they may want you to be. So be mindful of that, because this is around your rights and protections for you and of those that you would serve. Also point out there's been some good conversation just about, being self-employed in the psychedelic industry and as a facilitator is complex. And there's been some comments in the chat about restrictions around the OARs, for around Measure 109 and OPS, and that everybody in this series is going to have their own viewpoint, and it's from their specialty. And it really is a complex, area that, we all have to kind of sift through this. And what Justin, is recommending does not supersede what comes out of OPS. And they're very vague, and let's work collectively to try to present these questions to OPS as well to get the answers out of it. And so just bear that in mind as we're learning from all of these professionals out there, is that this is within their scope, and it doesn't mean that for your particular licensure that would be, some of these things might be different. Very challenging. Yeah, this was great, Justin. And I think next session we'll have a lot of really, really great information. Is there any questions right now that folks have? Feel free to raise hands or just chime in if you want to. You are also welcome to just enter a question into the chat, and I will answer that.
I can't remember how to raise my hand on here, but I do have a question, if I may. So I do have an LLC and I am a facilitator, but I have not actually done any services yet that I've been paid for or anything like that. So do you owe taxes with an LLC if you have not actually made income?
You do not. You don't have to file a tax return until you have over $400 of income, sales income from it.
Awesome. Thank
It's a
you.
small number. It's a small number, but yeah. And you actually don't even have to file a tax return if, say, your expenses exceed your well, no, I take that back. You do have to file a tax return, but you can file it late if you want to. If you don't owe, if you're not going to owe taxes, like if you had less than $400 of net income, so your expenses exceeded your income, then you can take your time to file your tax returns. You don't need to run out and do it right away because, but if that's your only income. Otherwise, if you've exceeded about $12,500 or you have self-employment income of over net over $400, and you need to file a tax return. But if you're like living off of savings right now and you're just accumulating expenses, then you don't need to worry about it too much. But eventually you will.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a little bit as far as what is allowed and what is not allowed. I do know that there's some language considerations that we have to be careful with the state regulations and whatnot. But I find that that as far as the things that I'm talking about, even though I may be using different language, it's not too difficult to stay within like a usual framework for being independent or not being independent. I just was reading that independent contractor.
Yep. Question for you, Justin. As a tax professional that's filing taxes, in this industry, and understand your approach is very much to completely cover it so that there's no loopholes and nothing can be poked in there to really make it solid. How do you see, or is there a threshold that you see for facilitators to filing a tax return, of having a tax professional, whether or not it's you or any of the other amazing CPAs that are out there that are knowledgeable? One, maybe is that knowledge really important? And two, is there some threshold that would be like, if you met this point, you probably should have some more professional advice versus somebody that may go at it using QuickBooks or something else like that?
Yeah, I think that you should at least have like an hour meeting with somebody, like a business professional. That you got to find somebody who's going to be receptive to work with the psilocybin industry. But some people are like, if you come in as an authority and you say like, listen, like I'm a facilitator in the psilocybin industry, I'm a regular business, I'm not trafficking, you don't need to worry about it. Then the accountant who may be really good with just working with businesses, that's who you want to work with. They don't need to worry about, they don't need to be worrying about 280E for you, that kind of thing. As long as you know what you have to be concerned about. Like you're not supposed to be trafficking, right? As a facilitator, you're not touching the medicine. And so at least have a conversation with somebody. I would recommend working with an accountant. It just saves you so much time and money, and then they can kind of watch your watch what you're doing, and then kind of decide, well, maybe it's time to choose an S corporation, choose to be taxed as an S corp. So an LLC being taxed as an S corporation. For services and expenses, I see there's a question. Anything and everything having to do with operating your business is deductible. You want to, if you're operating out of a home office, so I would, if you're an independent, like you're an independent contractor, you don't have employees, you don't have an outside office, you can set up a home office. Then you can claim the miles that it takes to get you to the service center to do your thing. And then you claim the miles getting back. So you keep track of your miles. You keep track of your even your home expenses. You can take a percentage of them. But licensing, the registration with the Secretary of State, I think that you could even write off your facilitation costs for when you did the training. Your licensing, of course, is all deductible. I would keep track of miles, like I said, home office, telephone, internet, computer stuff, any expenses that go out for clients, continuing education, legal and professional fees, accountants and attorneys, office expenses, office supplies. Those are all things that you can deduct everything, the travel. Like say you go to a conference, you can deduct the travel to that conference. You can deduct the conference fees. You can deduct the 50% of the meals that you had while you were there. Everything and anything. You just want to make sure you have your own bank account, like a separate bank account. Now, that's where you have to be careful. Like you don't want to necessarily name your LLC psilocybin facilitator extraordinaire, because you will not get a bank account that way. You need to have something like your name or maybe abbreviation, and you can just say that you might have to lie to the bank. And that's one thing that people worry about. They're like, oh, are we money laundering? Am I committing a crime? And and I don't know if you are. I don't know if you are by saying, hey, I do counseling, I'm a counselor, or I'm just saying, tell it to the bank, not to Oregon, but I'm just saying like, hey, you need to like not tell them that you do psilocybin-assisted therapy. That you can't say that to a bank. You should be able to get a bank account though, as long as your LLC is like nondescript and you go in and you're like, I need a bank account and I'm providing caregiving services or something like that, something close to what you're doing, but don't mention psilocybin. You can get a bank account. You can get a legal bank account. You're typically not deducting a lot or transacting a lot in cash. So, and then of course there's First Citizens Bank who they'll set up a bank account for you. Yes, Jason, when you popped on, I was like, oh yeah, First Citizens Bank is someone who they charge fees. I think it's a little bit, they charge like, I don't know how much they charge, but they typically charge fees. And then someone like Chase or some of these other ones, you can get a bank. You're not trafficking, you can get a bank account. But they may not open the bank account for you if you tell them that you're doing psilocybin-assisted therapy type of stuff. So
I put in the chat the name of the contact with First Citizens, Martha Sheets. She is the primary person there, is really heading up and trying to get First Citizens to be accepted, and they are what I've learned from her. And she's a great advocate for all of us. Is that the concern from the bank and higher up is that they don't understand the difference between facilitation and the actual giving of products. And so they're saying every time if you bring that up, they're just automatically going to that point that they think that you're dispersing the substances and you're selling the substances. If you're not, you're not. So use that.
Typically banks won't necessarily shut you down unless they there's no reason for them to really inquire. Usually it's cash. Like if you're putting in a lot of cash, then they get suspicious. But First Citizens, I would definitely recommend anybody who's doing plant touching work, they need to go to a psilocybin bank, somebody who will work with businesses in the industry. So hopefully the fees aren't too much for facilitators there. I'm not sure what they are.
Any other questions while we're on? And then we can transition. I'll shut off the recording and we can continue having a conversation for Justin, you have another 10 minutes. Is that
yeah
for you?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I got about 10 minutes. Yeah.
And then otherwise, we'll be continuing this on and kind of diving into more of the accounting questions in the next session, and then followed by the legal. So any questions folks have for right now? You'd like to chime in and ask?
So the question was about an employee owned. Is that what an ESOP is? Employee owned company? Do you want to?
Yeah, or it stands for employee stock ownership plan. I was just curious if this is a little bit off topic, but if nobody else has on topic questions, I was just curious about it as a structure for a service center, because they're exempt from federal and state income taxes. So just as like if it's entirely employee, like if the ESOP owns an entire company, I was just curious if that was a structure that you'd
Yeah, I actually
encountered
don't know a lot about them. I assume that they're tax exempt because they pay out all their income to their employees each year, and so they're not paying corporate taxes, but I imagine they're actually being taxed as a corporation, but maybe the way that it's organized or structured. Otherwise, I'd have to see the number, like there's the 501c3s and those kinds of things. I'd have to do research on that number. And I do know that like nonprofits are not allowed, like if you're plant touching. So for 280E purposes, I feel like I would have heard about it if it was viable, like in the cannabis industry, but maybe.
Well, if you Google it, there's a handful of articles from the cannabis space about cannabis companies that are doing it. It's an S corp, but it's the reason that it's tax exempt is to incentivize like employee ownership, so but pass through income like from the S corp is
if it's an S corp, then no S corp, no matter what it is it pays tax. It is a pass through. You get a K1, but I can imagine it 280 not applying to it. I can't quite imagine that unless the K1. So I'll have to
280E
consider send me an article or something like that. I would definitely be interested in hearing about that.
Yeah, because I think 280E 280E would apply. It just wouldn't matter because you don't need to take deductions, to get around the taxes on those. I'll send you an article.
Send me an article because I don't know about that. I haven't. Let's see here. I'll look at that, and then maybe I can address that next time we visit.
And Tony, I'd love to see that article as well.
Okay.
Also in the nonprofit. Okay, so a question came up about the recording. We will be providing this on our YouTube channel, and I will if you're part of our system, you'll get it, or I'll also send it out through the meetup. Everybody that can watch that after we do some editing and make it look pretty. We'll make it available for everybody. So thank you everyone really for attending today. Look forward to seeing you in the upcoming ones. And Justin, thank you for your time and effort and everything you're doing for the industry. And if I'm going to stop the recording, and if folks have additional questions, please stay on, and we'll answer them for a few more minutes. Thank you, everyone.